Following the Q&A, we'll immediately transition to a panel discussion that will include Kevin Hassett, Andrew Biggs, Norm Ornstein from AEI, and Bill Gale from the Brookings Institution. Senator Portman, the floor is yours.
Alex, thanks very much. Over the years, I've taken full advantage of AEI staff and fellows. And on tax reform, no one more than Alex Brill. He made the mistake of showing me on the Ways and Means Committee years ago that he knew his way around, not only on policy, but also on politics, which is a dangerous and rare combination. And so, Alex, I will tell you today that I expect you to continue to give me guidance and advice. I also want to thank other friends at AEI. Andrew Biggs is here, I know, Kevin Hassett, Norm Ornstein, and Arthur Brooks. I continue to want to seek your help and guidance. I appreciate it. Mark Thiessen has actually provided me a lot of guidance because his wife is my legislative director, Pam, who does a terrific job, and I know has had a lot of late nights, particularly over the past several months. Alex mentioned my 4 months on the so-called super committee, which in fact I found to be not so super much of the time, but it was an incredibly important experience to have because I think through it, as I'll talk about later, we've learned a lot about how we can move forward even though the super committee was not successful. One positive aspect for me was I got an avalanche of good ideas. I, at the start of the process, set up on my website a form for Ohioans to give us ideas on deficit reduction. And as of Monday, we had 17,462 submissions. These didn't just come from Ohio, they ended up coming in from all over the country, but a lot of good common sense ideas, including changing unemployment benefits to incentivize hiring by giving small businesses a tax incentive, privatizing and reforming Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, a tax credit for seniors who continue working and choose to forego Medicare and Social Security. So as you can see, these were good, substantive ideas, some of which we were able to work into the process, but at the end we're not successful in having a final package. But my favorite idea may have been from John in Cincinnati. And his idea was that the United States should merge with Canada. And it's interesting because I told John when I responded to him that we better do it quickly because Prime Minister Harper is about to cut Canada's already low corporate tax rate to 15%. So we may be losing some businesses there unless we do that. But what I'd like to do today is to talk a little about some of these ideas and to enter into a dialogue of what comes next after the super committee. But first, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves why the committee was formed in the first place. As Alex has talked about, there is a divide in Washington, which I think is reflective of the divide in the country over some of these fundamental policy issues. And the super committee, I think, was born of a recognition of that divided government and different philosophies, but also by the fact that our fiscal and economic challenges are too urgent not to address. And so this committee was set up with special expedited procedures where we could provide to the House and the Senate on a majority vote basis rather than the normal supermajority in the Senate, a product that was voted on without amendment. I was asked to join the committee by our leadership. It's not something that I sought, but when I was asked, I accepted. And I did so knowing that it would be very tough to reach consensus. I did so in the context of a comment made by one of my colleagues that week that joining the super committee would be like having a root canal. I agreed that probably it would be close to having a root canal, but that it was too critical for us not to try. We just can't wait for someone else. My view was and remains we can't wait for the next president. We can't wait for the next Congress. We need to act, and we need to act now. And the urgency is particularly profound because of what's happened over the last few years. The economic policies that this administration has followed and what the Congress did in the first 2 years of the Obama administration has made the problems even more urgent because they have accelerated the potential for an economic and fiscal train wreck. Some would say that the answer is raising tax rates, that our current tax burden just can never generate the revenues needed to govern this big and complex country. I would remind us that only several years ago, 4 years ago, back in 2007, we had almost a balanced budget with the same tax code we have today and the same tax rates. When I left the Office of Management and Budget in 2007, that fiscal year, the budget deficit was $161 billion, about 1/8 of today's deficit, representing about 1.2% of the economy. A major difference was that discretionary spending, the non-emergency, annually appropriated spending of Congress, was 17% lower in FY 2007 than it is today. So there has been a big spike in terms of spending. Obviously, the financial crisis in 2008 and the subsequent recession has led to reduced revenues, no question about it. But the big increase in our deficits and debt to these dangerous levels is also driven by unprecedented spending that expanded the size and the scope of government without its promised economic benefits. In a few short years, this administration has now presided over a 21% increase in the growth of government and has taken spending as a share of the economy to levels we've not seen since World War II. So the President, at this point, seems intent on doubling down on his policies. His September submission to the Supercommittee, I think, kind of said it all. Ignoring the recommendations, by the way, of his own Debt Reduction Commission, the President proposed $1.6 trillion in new taxes and no serious structural reforms to bring solvency to our troubled entitlement programs. Instead, he asked the Supercommittee to handle even more spending. He proposed a $447 billion new stimulus bill, his so-called jobs plan, and asked the Supercommittee not just to handle what we had already been asked to do, but to handle an additional $447 billion of deficit reduction, which made our job harder. Despite the absence of presidential leadership on trying to make our job easier, and counter to what you may have heard from others, I do believe that my Democratic and Republican colleagues on the committee worked with seriousness of purpose and in good faith. I think members tried to come up with a sensible solution. In the end, though, the same core philosophical differences that have paralyzed Congress from making progress also prevented the Committee of 12 from coming to an agreement. The failure of this process, as I said earlier, is profoundly disappointing. But it also left me even more determined to forge ahead on the twin challenges of our time, building the economic and fiscal policies necessary to unleash the job creation potential of the American economy and to restore our nation's long-term fiscal health. These challenges aren't going away. Even though the committee's gone, the challenges remain. And by the way, these two challenges are necessarily linked. In my view, only with a growing economy and a larger tax base are we going to turn back the tide of record deficits and the huge debt that we face. At the same time, failing to address our national fiscal crisis in a serious way makes it very tough to get that economy moving. It only weakens our economy and erodes our competitiveness in the world. So saying we can tackle either our financial crisis, which is borne out by the $15 trillion debt that we had reported just 2 weeks ago, or we can address the economic slump we find ourselves in, to me is a false choice. We've got to do both. And in fact, they go hand in hand. The mounting debt is a drag on economic growth, on job creation. There are various studies that have looked at this. One that you've probably heard about is a 2008 study by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, who have come before us in Congress and met with a number of us as part of sort of an expanded gang of 6 to talk about their research and how they came up with their conclusions. But they have shown that once a country's debt burden reaches 90% of the economy, you have a significant downturn in economic growth. They say it's about a 1% to 2% reduction in GDP. As I calculated, in 2 decades, that would leave our country about 1/5, our economy about 1/5 smaller than it would otherwise be. So if we don't get our public debt to GDP ratio, which is now at 100%, in other words, our public debt is equal to the entire size of our economy, if we don't reduce that, we will continue to create, as I calculated, about 1 million fewer jobs annually. So the pressure of the Annual deficits and the debt does have an impact short-term on our economy. I think that has to be acknowledged, as well as obviously the longer-term generational issues it represents. But let's be clear. We have primarily a long-term spending problem. That's our number one issue. It's not a revenue problem. Even if we kept the current tax rates in place, meaning that taxes won't go up a year and a month from now as they're scheduled to do, revenues are still expected to rebound above the historical average of 18%. That's based on the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office analysis. So even if you assume that all the so-called Bush tax cuts, which are scheduled to expire at the end of next year, continue, we still have revenue as a percent of GDP just above the historical average. If, in fact, the 01 and 03 tax cuts are allowed to expire as scheduled and Washington reverts to what is called current law, then revenues by 2014 would top 20% of GDP, or more than 1/10 above the historical average. So the deficit is rising in large part because of the tough economic times, but also because of federal spending. Historically, 20% of the economy has jumped. It's jumped to 24% of the economy this year, and without changes, again, based on Congressional Budget Office projections, it will rise to 30, 40, and 50% of the economy over the coming decades. You've heard those pushing for trillions in higher taxes appeal to the need for a balanced approach. Basic philosophy is I'll give you $1 in spending cuts if you give me a $1 in new taxes. And I think this misses the big picture. Raising tax rates to chase soaring spending would upset a far more fundamental balance in our country. And that's the balance between the federal government and a free and vibrant economy. More space for government means less space for individual Americans to pursue and enjoy the rewards of hard work, industry, risk-taking, and innovation. A massive tax increase would deal a blow to the fragile U.S. economy, leading to less growth, diminished wages, and fewer jobs. As a practical matter, even large tax increases just can't keep up with our dangerous levels of spending. Some of you know former CEA Chairman Glenn Hubbard. He recently calculated that accommodating the President's spending plans and his budget would require across-the-board tax increases of 20% over the next decade and 60% over the next 25 years. That would probably make even my most aggressive Democrat counterparts on the super committee blush. The short of it is, if we don't deal with our spending problem, we can't solve our impending fiscal crisis. Doesn't mean we should leave our tax system alone. It's broken. And once fixed, it can help, both to get our economy moving and raise more revenue through growth. Second, we need to be sure that we are modernizing our entitlement programs. So along with pro-growth tax reform, which is needed, we need modernization of these important programs that otherwise are unsustainable. And third, we need savings through government-wide spending reforms. On the tax front, as an alternative to proposals from committee Democrats for $1 trillion or more in new revenue over the next 10 years, Republicans on the committee supported pro-growth tax reform that would produce a more efficient tax system while yielding $250 billion in new revenues. This money would have been raised by scaling back preferences, exemptions, and itemized deductions for the top two brackets, while at the same time lowering marginal tax rates for all taxpayers. The work of one of AEI's economic advisors, Professor Marty Feldstein, many of you know, helped influence this proposal. The optimal way, of course, to do tax reform would be to reinvest all of the savings from reducing preferences into broadening the base, lowering rates in order to create jobs. And the economic analysis on that is clear. But in the context of this committee, we were willing to concede that some static tax revenue for the sake of entitlement savings to both achieve pro-growth tax reform and avoid the risk of the largest tax increase in American history a year from now. We sought tax certainty. Entrepreneurs and small business owners are well aware that a year and a month from now, there is a risk that taxes could increase dramatically. A $3 trillion tax hike is currently scheduled. Our aim was to provide certainty with regard to current capital gains, dividend, and estate taxes, and to lower marginal rates in order to bring more investment off the sidelines to create jobs. We were not successful in that effort because most Democrats weren't prepared to work from that framework. But I believe it provides a way forward. All is not lost on the pro-growth front. I'm a strong advocate of tax reform, including individual tax reform and corporate, where there is no concern on the corporate side over baseline issues and where there is a more broadly accepted consensus that lower rates are critical to our competitiveness. During our deliberations, the New York Times quoted an anonymous Republican staffer on the committee saying, quote, "Portman is the most gung-ho for tax reform. He's the chihuahua in the room, constantly yapping about it." I don't think that was meant as a compliment, but I did focus on tax reform a lot because I think it's critical both to get our fiscal house in order and to get the economy moving. More importantly, as part of our committee deliberations, my colleagues and I from both sides of the aisle collaborated to put together a conceptual corporate tax reform proposal that was scored as deficit neutral by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. I'm pleased to announce today that I'll soon introduce pro-growth corporate tax reform that's revenue neutral, that lowers the rate to 25%, and that moves us to a territorial tax system. I hope we'll have co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. As you know, with the exception of Japan, the United States now has the highest corporate tax rates in the developed world, on average 39.2% combined federal and state rate. Over the past 20 years, every one of the major foreign competitors we have has moved to cut rates. 20 years ago, the average among the developed countries in the OECD was 39%. Today, it's 25%. The United States alone has failed to act to make its corporate tax system more competitive, and we're paying for it. Paradoxically, as AEI has reported, despite our high corporate tax rates, the United States actually collects less corporate tax revenue as a share of GDP than most of those other countries. One reason for this is that high-tax jurisdictions like the United States have a harder time attracting new investment. This translates into fewer jobs created. Some have criticized our current system as allowing big U.S. companies to pay little or no taxes during some years. This base broadening reform we're talking about will ensure that all companies pay taxes through a more efficient tax code that will create more jobs. American workers are paying the price in more ways than one. Economic studies have shown that the burden of high corporate rates falls mostly on labor. CBO has reported that 70% or more of the corporate burden of taxation is borne by workers in the form of lower wages. It's no wonder that policymakers across the spectrum, the Obama administration, Chairman Dave Camp of the House Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Max Baucus of the Finance Committee, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, have all cited the need for us to overhaul our corporate tax code. Chairman Camp actually has begun a very serious process to do that in the Ways and Means Committee. Our proposal brings the top rate down from 35% to 25%, primarily by reducing inefficiencies, preferences, and exemptions. And to those who say it can't be done, again, we have an estimate from the Joint Tax Committee showing you can do it on a deficit-neutral basis. But the U.S. high statutory rate isn't the only obstacle to competitiveness. The current corporate tax code actually penalizes U.S. companies for reinvesting profits they earn overseas back here at home. Our tax code gives firms a choice between keeping those earnings abroad, tax-free permanently, or paying a steep tax bill if they choose to bring the money home. That lockout effect has trapped an estimated $1.5 trillion overseas, translating into foregone U.S. jobs and investment. Our proposal would fix this by moving to a territorial tax system. This means we would tax income where it's generated, as the vast majority of our competitors do. By adopting a territorial tax regime of our own, we'll empower U.S. corporations to compete and win customers in foreign markets across the world. The export opening trade agreements recently enacted by Congress with Korea, Colombia, and Panama were incredibly important to get the United States back into the game of breaking down foreign barriers to U.S. products and services. We need to do more there. But it's also time to eliminate this tax-driven competitive disadvantage of our own making. Corporate tax reform is central to a strategy of economic growth and job creation. In 2005, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is sometimes known to be skeptical of so-called dynamic scoring, reported that reductions in corporate marginal rates have the greatest effect on long-term growth. By lowering rates and moving to a territorial system, we can do something big and something permanent at a critical time where we need to strengthen our economy and create more jobs, at a time when we also need to help reduce the deficit through growth revenues. The second major front of deficit reduction, as noted earlier, is entitlement modernization. It's impossible to tackle the mounting debt and deficit that are holding back job creation without addressing the currently unsustainable costs of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The long-term cost of these entitlements, along with interest on the debt, is projected to squeeze out the cost of every other federal program within a couple of decades, leaving little to nothing for other government priorities. Take Medicare. It's projected to spend well over $6 trillion during the next decade. There's a perception that all Medicare benefits are pre-funded through payroll taxes and therefore couldn't or shouldn't be reformed. I'll give you an example of a typical two-income couple retiring today. This is a couple with incomes of $50,000 or more. They will have paid about $119,000 in lifetime Medicare taxes, yet will receive $357,000 in Medicare benefits, or $3 in benefits for every dollar collected. Without structural reforms and a transition to a consumer-driven system, Medicare as we know it is simply not sustainable. Some Democrats, including the White House press secretary a couple of days ago and Senator Chuck Schumer on Meet the Press yesterday, have noted that I gave Democrats within the super committee credit for putting entitlement reforms on the table. I did. And I think it's good that they put entitlements on the table because America's future depends on both Republicans and Democrats coming together to address the issue. What Senator Schumer and the White House press secretary failed to mention, conveniently, was that I also said that they only did so in the context of huge new tax increases of over $1 trillion over the next decade. But it is critical for us to come together to address the entitlement crisis. And part of the reason we have a crisis is that Congress long ago chose to put these programs on autopilot. In other words, the United States chose, and it's the only country in the world that I can find, not to have a budget for these entitlement programs. So when you look around the world, other countries, even countries that have very generous programs, have a budget for health care, for instance. The United States does not. We set eligibility and benefits guidelines and then write a check. Social Security is budgeted similarly. So we shouldn't be surprised when the autopilot costs grow so rapidly. The roughly 40% of the budget that's discretionary spending is subject, of course, to annual appropriations. And this means there's a debate, there is a spirited discussion as to what our priorities are, and at the end of the day, there are votes. And along with that comes accountability. With regard to entitlements, the largest and fastest growing part of our budget, there's no workable mechanism to budget for the costs or to make those trade-offs among competing priorities. A bipartisan coalition of think tanks and former CBO directors has endorsed putting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid on a long-term budget, and then having Congress keep those programs on the budget, or to face a consequence, which would be certain reforms that are built into the system. This would provide much-needed oversight and accountability for these rapidly expanding federal programs, and I intend to introduce legislation along those lines. In an era of trillion-dollar deficits, the American people can't afford more blank checks without accountability. The third front of deficit reduction, of course, consists of cuts to non-entitlement federal spending. I supported and continue to support the cut, cap, and balance legislation that would return federal spending to its historical average. In my time as OMB director, I became ever more convinced that it was necessary for Washington to have the discipline of a balanced budget, just as the vast majority of our states do. Until a balanced budget can be enacted, my view is that Congress has to prove its mettle as a responsible steward of taxpayer dollars, including attacking waste, duplication, and obsolete spending on the discretionary part of the budget, if it is to earn the trust of the American people it will need in order to reform those important entitlement programs we talked about. No federal spending should go unexamined. Clearly, Washington is not working. The nation's mounting debt and deficits are holding back job creation, keeping millions of Americans out of work. In my view, another round of stimulus spending is not the answer. We've tried that. The economy needs entrepreneurs to come off the sidelines and hire and invest. The way to do that is through pro-growth policies, including deficit-neutral corporate tax reform that brings some hundreds of billions of dollars back to these shores, and budget reform that forces Washington to modernize and strengthen important entitlement programs. Add in common sense reductions in non-entitlement spending, and we'll have a truly, what I would consider, a balanced approach to deficit reduction and job creation. While final resolution eluded us, the Supercommittee's work can benefit the cause of deficit reduction. Through lengthy discussions, Republicans and Democrats alike gained a better understanding of each other's viewpoints and frameworks, and we produced proposals on both spending and revenue that can help provide a framework, a basis for an eventual solution. We've built a structure, as I said, for fundamental corporate tax reform, generated serious proposals to reform not only major entitlement programs, but also areas like federal pay and benefits, federal property sales, government fees, agriculture programs. After all, the committee may have disbanded, but the profound fiscal and economic issues we face have not gone away. In fact, they've only become more pressing. We've always come together as Americans to solve tough problems. From a Great Depression to world wars, we can solve this problem too. But only if we work together, as Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, to roll up our sleeves and forge a consensus to meet the twin challenges of our time. Thanks for letting me be with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Senator Portman's got about 10 minutes for a Q&A, and do you want to call on your own?
I can do that.
I can do that. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon, Senator. I'd like to ask you, do you believe that there's any validity in some of the criticisms that have been promoted by the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy DC movements with respect to tax reform in general?
Well, I addressed that briefly because one of the things that I've heard from not just the Occupy Wall Street folks, but from a lot of critics of our current tax system is that there are big corporations that don't pay any taxes. They've also criticized other elements of our tax system on the individual side. But as I said earlier, I think part of the answer to that is to have a fundamental reform of our tax code, broaden the base. The reason some corporations don't pay taxes is they take full advantage of the incredible complexity in our current tax code. And in order to lower the rate to 25% and do it on a revenue neutral basis, you end up getting rid of almost all those complexities. And so companies that currently pay little or no taxes would be paying a higher effective rate. Other companies that don't take advantage of all those preferences in the code, tax breaks in the code, would be paying lower taxes. But everybody would be paying taxes. It also leads, of course, to a more efficient tax code where resources are allocated in a way that helps create economic growth and jobs. So to me, it's a classic example of what we can do across party lines, addressing some of those concerns. And again, this supercommittee process was frustrating. We didn't achieve what I'd hoped we would. I had high hopes. But we did achieve some results, and one was coming together as Republicans and Democrats alike and putting together at least a framework for dealing with this issue of corporate taxes. So I'm hopeful that one of the products of the committee is that Congress will now have the ability to move forward on this. There has not been a Joint Tax Committee scored revenue neutral proposal at 25% and territorial ever in the history of the U.S. Congress. So this is something that I think will be able to help move the discussion forward, not just on deficit reduction, but also on economic growth. Yes. Heather.
Isabel Jasinowski with Goodyear from the great state of Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And we're very lucky to have you in the Senate and on the super committee, even if it didn't work out. And that's a little bit what I wanted to ask. I know you were desirous of getting into next opportunities to address these issues. And if you could tell us, and you also said, which I think we all totally agree with, we can't wait till elections and this kind of thing. So what do you see as the possibility of moving some of these issues along into a final package that can pass? Thank you.
Well, as I said earlier, it would have been a great opportunity to move forward because of the special expedited procedures, particularly in the United States Senate. Norm and I talked a little about that a moment ago, but it's very difficult to have a controversial issue addressed in the Senate because it requires 60 votes with some rare exceptions like reconciliation. And also being subject to amendment, sometimes it's difficult to move something through the process. And so this was an opportunity that was missed in my view. Having said that, I still think there is the opportunity over the next year to make significant progress. I say that for 3 reasons. One, I do think that the committee has put forward a lot of good ideas that can now be picked up by members on both sides of the aisle in both houses. I mentioned the corporate tax reform idea and some entitlement ideas, and also some of the non-entitlement mandatory spending ideas that we spent an enormous amount of time on, as did the Biden group, by the way, before us, as did the Simpson-Bowles Commission, as did the Rivlin-Domenici Commission. A lot of you in this room have been involved in some of these efforts, so there's a more thorough vetting of some of these proposals. Second, we're going to have to address a lot of tough issues in the next year. Immediately, the issue of unemployment insurance extension and the payroll tax extension and other extenders, tax extenders at year end. There are about 87 of them at my last count. And then next year, of course, as I noted, at the end of next year, 13 months from now, we will once again be dealing with this issue of the 01 and 03 tax issues and also the alternative minimum tax. And without addressing them, I think we're talking about a $3 trillion tax increase on the 01 and 03 rates, and I think it's about $4.6 trillion when you include AMT and other extenders. So this will force a conversation, and that conversation, in my view, ought to be about both economic growth and deficit reduction, not just about how you deal with the specific issue that is expiring and has to be addressed. And third, although, as I said earlier, I think the committee represented, unfortunately, a lot of where Congress is, and frankly, where the American people are, I do think that folks are looking for some answers here on the spending side. I mean, as I'm home, as I was over the past several days, a lot of people talk to me, as they always do, about, direction our country is headed and what we need to do. And I think people are more and more informed and educated on what the choices are and are willing to make some tough choices. So I think the environment is actually conducive to making some of these tough decisions. Maybe not at the level that some have called for, sort of going big, which would be something I would support with the right balance. And in fact, of course, I supported 2 budget proposals that do go big. One being the Ryan budget that passed the House, didn't pass the Senate, but did pass the House and reduces deficits by about $6 trillion over the next 10 years. But I think that environment is there. So both because there's sort of more proposals now to build a foundation for some specific legislative action because of the inevitable decisions Congress is going to have to make, and because of the environment, I think even over the next year there's a good possibility for reform, and that's what I'm going to continue to work on. I'm disappointed by what happened with regard to the super committee, but more determined than ever to address these issues. Yeah.
Good to see you again, Senator. It's Leon
Good to see you.
Peace Consulting. Senator, on the individual income tax side, just one particular interest, do you envision that there'd be any further limitation on the home mortgage interest deductions?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the framework that some of us supported in the committee process has promise, and that framework would require big changes in the way the individual tax code treats not just mortgage deduction, but also other tax preferences. I mentioned Marty Feldstein, who gave a speech actually at the AEI annual dinner several months ago about this very topic. And his point was that there's about $1 trillion a year in expenditures in the tax code on the individual side. And his view is that much of that should be considered more like spending than tax policy. And I think there's some truth to that. And so I think when you look at individual tax reform, there seems to be a consensus building around lowering the marginal rates, broadening the base by either eliminating or limiting some of the tax preferences, tax breaks, tax loopholes, depending what you want to call them, or tax expenditures. So I think, yeah, I think there are a lot of promising ideas out there. The presidential candidates on the Republican side each seem to have their own idea. I'm not going to get into 999 or 2020 or in 20, but I think you know, all of the current expenditures in the code are going to be subject to close examination. And at the end of the day, I do believe that, as I said, I'm a supporter of tax reform. I believe lower rates will create more economic growth, and I believe that that is part of the solution to not just our economic problems, but also to our deficit problems, because more growth will lead to more revenues through more economic activity and more growth. Yeah.
Hi, Senator. Felicia Sonmez with Washington Post. I'm just wondering, some in the Senate have called for a vote on the Simpson-Bowles plan. I know Senator Durbin has said that in recent days, and it doesn't really seem like there are any other efforts underway to restart this negotiations for a broad-reaching debt reduction plan. Is that vote something that you would support, or do you think there's some other way that there might be another shot at a big deficit reduction plan?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. The issue, of course, is that there is no legislative proposal. And as we found out in getting scores from the Congressional Budget Office on the spending side and scores from the Joint Committee on Taxation on the tax side, going through that process, the discipline of that sometimes alters the way your proposal looks. And you know, I'd be supportive of any proposal like that coming to the floor and having a vote, but I think there's a challenge, honestly, in taking some great ideas and reducing them to legislative language that's vetted and scored. We had a number of ideas, as I said, that were sent to us as committee members. I listed some of them earlier, some of them serious and some of them, like merging with Canada, not as serious, but many of them are good ideas, but frankly, we couldn't get a score on them. So one example would be selling federal property. It's something that I heard a lot from my constituents about, and there is excess federal property or underutilized federal property. The Congressional Budget Office has a hard time giving us a score on that. We tried to set up various mechanisms to do it, including even a sequester of agency budgets unless they sold a certain amount of property. But that's one of the ideas in Gang of Six and Simpson-Bowles, but frankly, it's easier said than done. So part of the challenge is going to be coming up with legislative language and then literally scoring it to be sure that it can meet the Congressional Budget Office, in the case of revenue proposals, the Joint Tax Committee, estimates of deficit reduction. So it's a little more complicated than just taking a proposal and putting it on the floor, because there's not legislative language that's attached to it yet, and it hasn't been scored through the congressional process. So it would take a while. I think something could be constructed. I'm not quite sure what the numbers would look like in the end, but I think it's an effort, you know, worthy of trying. Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator. Elizabeth Sinclair, Tea Party patriot from Washington, D.C. I was wondering whether you and your Republican colleagues would get together on the steps of the Capitol and have a little Newt Gingrich-style press conference, a fiscal contract for America. Since we are in a catastrophe at this point, we don't have another year to wait, as you said. If you could get your words and that of those of your colleagues out to the American people who are angry, upset, very concerned, and as wonderful and measured as you are, we feel like we're in serious trouble, and we need to get the word out to the masses. Thank you. So a fiscal contract for America, could you get it out to us, please?
Yeah. As you may know, I worked a lot on an economic platform for America through the United States Senate Republican caucus. I took the lead on putting together a jobs plan. And the first element of it was fiscal issues, because as I said earlier, I believe that they are connected. We can't get the economy moving until there's some more certainty as to what's happening on the fiscal side. So my only addendum to what you're saying is I think it ought to be both. I think it ought to be about the fiscal issues, and it ought to be about how to get the economy moving. I talked a lot about tax reform today because that was something that I'm now going to be trying to promote, but it includes regulatory relief. It includes lower health care costs through some sensible proposals to put the consumer more in charge. It has to include more energy development, exploration, and use here in this country, which will create a lot of jobs in states like Ohio and elsewhere. And it has to include, in my view, greatly expanded trade, accessing customers outside of the United States, the 95% of consumers who don't live in our country. Most countries do a lot more of that than we do, and will create enormous potential for more jobs here. So I think we need to do a better job of communicating on all those issues, but I don't believe that you can solve one without the other. I don't know how you deal with these, maybe 12 points, yeah. Ours was 7, which seemed like a lot, but it is critical. We have dug ourselves into such a deep fiscal hole, as I said earlier, that it is not possible for us, in my view, to get out of that deep fiscal hole without doing both spending reductions and smart pro-growth policies to grow the economy, and through those growth revenues to be able to work our way out of it. The overhang is now too heavy, and so I would hope that we as Republicans, and for that matter, Republicans and Democrats alike, would do a better job explaining those challenges to the American people and understanding those challenges, you know, coming up with smart solutions. It's not easy, as we found out in our process. You know, there are some very strong feelings on both sides of the aisle, on our side about revenues, on the Democrat side about entitlements. But the reason I've gone out of my way to make the point that Democrats put entitlements on the table, and I give them credit for that, and also made the point, as I did today, about Republicans having put revenue on the table in the context of pro-growth reform, is that there were some very difficult political challenges we faced in the committee, but there were also some lines that were crossed, and I think that forms the basis for, you know, eventual solution.
Senator, we'd like you to stay all afternoon. I know you have a schedule.
I'm going to take one more,
Okay.
Alex, because
All
this
right.
guy's been...
Senator, 2 things. One, I'm assuming that the Democrat you mentioned working with on the corporate tax reform was at least Senator Baucus, and I was wondering if you would expect support from him and other Democrats if you bring your bill forward in the full Senate. And secondly, why do you think that Democrats on the committee would not agree to a smaller deal of around $600 billion, that, like we heard mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
I'm Dan Friedman. I'm with National Journal. Thanks.
Hey, Dan, I've avoided talking about my colleagues in this committee for 4 months now, much to the dismay of some of our colleagues from the press here. And so I don't want to start now in talking about what happened behind closed doors, but I will say, with regard to Chairman Baucus, he's very interested in corporate tax reform and individual tax reform. He's made that known. He's done a lot of work in the area, as has Senator Hatch, by the way, on the Republican side. And I had the opportunity to work with both of their staffs over the last 3 and 4 months on this issue. So I do think that both of them are very interested, and I believe in this case there is a common approach to not just lowering the rates and broadening the base, but putting this out as a priority because they understand it's important for economic growth and deficit reduction. With regard to my colleagues, could you restate that second question?
Why do you think they didn't want to agree to a smaller?
Yeah, I talked about that some publicly already, so I will again. But it's too bad because at the end of the day, there was a proposal to at least make significant progress, not to hit the 1.2 mark, but to come close, about halfway there. Alex said earlier that he thought that's where the committee was likely to end up. I was more optimistic. I thought we'd hit our goal of 1.2 to avoid sequester altogether. But that 600 included some slight changes on the entitlement side in the area of means testing. But there was also a proposal for 550 to take that out. So even without any health care, or for that matter, any entitlement changes, there was an opportunity for us to move forward. And you have to ask Democrats why it was not acceptable. What they said was that even that would require significant new tax revenues. And so that effort was abandoned. But it's too bad, because that would have taken us in the right direction in terms of dealing with mandatory spending. And as I said, the biggest part of the budget and also the fastest growing part of the budget. It wouldn't have made some of the fundamental and structural changes that need to be made, but it would have taken us down that road as compared to the sequester, which focuses almost exclusively on the discretionary side of the budget. But you'll have to ask Democrats for more detail on that. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.